Sometimes the medicine that saves your body destroys everything you thought you knew about your life. High in the Colorado Rockies, where the wind cuts through pine trees like a widow's wail, Jeremiah Hawthorne felt death creeping through his bones. For 6 months, the mountain man who once tracked wolves through blizzards had been reduced to a trembling skeleton, his legendary strength sapped by black veins that crawled beneath his skin like living shadows. 1,000 healers had tried, army surgeons with their bone saws, Ute shamans with their sacred herbs, even a Chinese medicine man who'd traveled from San Francisco with promises of ancient cures. All had failed. Then came Zara. She appeared at his cabin door during the worst storm of winter, her dark skin glistening with melted snow, her eyes holding secrets older than the mountains themselves. When she placed her palm against his burning forehead, the disease that had confounded every healer simply vanished. But as Jeremiah's strength returned, he began to understand that some cures come with a price no man should have to pay, and some healers carry powers that could reshape the very fabric of life and death. What happens when the person who saves your life holds the key to a truth that could destroy everything you've ever believed about healing, slavery, and redemption? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The moment Zara's hand lifted from his forehead, Jeremiah knew his world had tilted off its axis forever. He sat up in his rough-hewn bed, actually sat up, without the crushing weight of exhaustion that had pinned him like a boulder for half a year. The black veins that had writhed beneath his skin like serpents were gone, leaving only faint silver scars that caught the firelight. His massive hands, which had withered to skeletal claws, now flexed with familiar strength. How? The word scraped from his throat, raw with disuse and wonder. Zara stepped back from the bed, her calico dress steaming in the cabin's warmth. Snow still clung to her woolly hair, and her breath came in sharp puffs that spoke of a desperate journey through the storm. But her eyes, Lord. Her eyes held depths that made the mountain valleys seem shallow. Your sickness weren't natural, Mr. Hawthorne. Her voice carried the musical cadence of the deep south, each word carefully chosen. Someone put that poison in your blood with intention. Jeremiah swung his legs over the bedside, marveling at the simple act of movement without pain. 6 months ago, he'd been tracking a wounded elk through a blizzard, his 200-pound frame cutting through snowdrifts like a ship through waves. By spring, he couldn't lift a coffee cup without trembling. That's impossible. Curses are. He stopped. After what he'd just witnessed, the word impossible had lost all meaning. Are what, sir? Zara moved to his stone fireplace, extending her hands toward the dying embers. My grandmother could pull sickness from a man's bones with her bare hands. Her grandmother before her could speak to plants and make them give up their healing secrets. Power passes through bloodlines like water through riverbeds. The wind hammered against the cabin's shutters, but for the first time in months, Jeremiah didn't feel the cold seeping into his marrow. He studied the woman who'd materialized from the storm like an answer to prayers he'd been too proud to utter. Her skin was the rich brown of fertile earth, unmarked by the harsh mountain climate. Escaped slave, most likely, though he wouldn't ask. Too many people in these territories were running from something. Who sent you? He reached for the wool shirt draped over his chair, fingers steady for the first time since the sickness began. Nobody sent me. I felt you dying. She turned from the fire, and he caught something ancient in her expression, not age, but weight, the kind of burden that came from seeing too much, surviving too much. Death has a particular sound when it's unnatural, like a bell ringing underwater. I've been following that sound for 3 days. Jeremiah pulled on his shirt, the fabric no longer hanging loose on a wasted frame. His body remembered its proper proportions, muscles filling out as if the last 6 months had been nothing more than a fever dream. But the silver scars remained, mapping his skin with proof of what he'd endured. The doctors said it was consumption, or maybe poison from bad water. Doctors can't see what they ain't trained to look for. Zara's gaze fixed on the silver marks threading his forearms. "That there's curse sign. Someone wanted you to suffer slow, wanted you to feel every day of dying. That takes a particular kind of hatred." The word hatred struck something deep in Jeremiah's chest. He'd made enemies during the war, Confederate sympathizers who'd fled west after Appomattox, men who blamed Union medics like him for keeping their enemies alive to fight another day. But this felt personal in a way that made his newly healed blood run cold. "You said bloodlines." He moved to the window, peering through gaps in the shutters at the swirling snow. "Your people, they all have this gift?" "Had." The single word carried the weight of graveyards. Slave catchers don't much care for women who can heal without permission. Makes other folks start thinking dangerous thoughts about what else might be possible. Jeremiah understood the unspoken truth. In a world where human beings were treated as property, a woman who could command life and death represented something too powerful to be controlled, the kind of power that could spark revolutions. A distant sound cut through the wind, the baying of hounds, still miles away but unmistakable. Zara's head snapped toward the door, her entire body going rigid. "They found me." She moved with sudden urgency, gathering the few possessions she'd apparently dropped by the entrance. A worn leather satchel, a walking stick carved with symbols that seemed to shift in the firelight. "I got to go." "Wait." Jeremiah's hand closed around her wrist, and he felt something electric pass between them, not romantic, but deeper, a recognition that their fates had become intertwined the moment she'd healed him. "Those hounds are tracking through a blizzard. They'll find this cabin whether you're here or not." The baying grew closer, and with it came the thunder of hoofbeats. Professional hunters, well-equipped and determined. "Then God help us both," Zara whispered, "because what's coming ain't just looking for me anymore." Jeremiah's hand moved to the rifle mounted above his door, a gesture so automatic it surprised him. For 6 months he'd barely possessed the strength to lift a coffee cup, yet now his body remembered its old instincts with startling clarity. The weight of the Springfield felt familiar in his grip, like shaking hands with an old friend. "How many?" he asked, checking the breech with practiced efficiency. Zara pressed her ear to the rough wooden door. 4 men, maybe 5. Dogs sound like they've been running hard. They'll be tired, but they ain't gonna stop. She glanced at his rifle, then at the hunting knife on his belt. "You know how to use those?" A bitter laugh escaped his throat. "I spent 3 years patching up boys who'd been torn apart by Confederate bullets. Learned real quick that sometimes the best medicine is making sure the other fellow can't hurt anybody else." But even as he spoke the words, Jeremiah felt the weight of what he'd be defending. This cabin wasn't just shelter, it was the life he'd painstakingly built after the war had finished breaking him. Every hand-hewn beam, every carefully chinked gap between the logs, represented a choice to keep breathing, when breathing felt like punishment. The main room held his most precious possessions. Medical texts salvaged from an abandoned army camp, their pages water-stained but legible. A daguerreotype of his unit, taken before Bull Run stole half their faces. The rocking chair he'd carved during the long nights, when sleep meant reliving the screams of men he couldn't save. Simple things, but they'd given him reason to wake each morning when the sickness hadn't yet claimed him. "This place means something to you," Zara observed, following his gaze around the cabin. "Built it with my own hands after I mustered out." He moved to the window, studying the approaching threat through the gaps in the shutters. "Figured if I was going to drink myself to death, I'd do it somewhere the bears might clean up my bones proper." The baying was closer now, maybe a mile out through the storm. Professional hunters knew how to pace their pursuit, how to save their strength for the final confrontation. These men had been tracking Zara through brutal weather, which meant they were either very well paid or very desperate. "Why here?" Zara asked. "Man with your skills could practice medicine in Denver, maybe even San Francisco. Make good money fixing up miners and railroad workers." Jeremiah's fingers tightened on the rifle stock. The answer sat heavy in his chest, a truth he'd buried as deep as the mountain snow. "Can't heal folks when your hands shake every time you touch blood. War took that away from me, left me seeing Confederate faces on every patient." He'd tried. God knows he'd tried. That first winter after the war, he'd hung out a shingle in a mining camp outside Central City. But the moment he'd bent over a wounded prospector, the man's beard had transformed into the grey whiskers of a dying rebel soldier, and Jeremiah's hands had frozen. The prospector had bled out while Jeremiah stood paralyzed by memories of field hospitals and gangrene. "But you helped me just fine," Zara said quietly. "You helped yourself. I just watched." The admission tasted like ashes. "Been watching a lot of things die up here. Easier that way." The wind carried new sounds now, men's voices calling to each other through the storm, coordinating their approach. Jeremiah counted at least 3 distinct tones, maybe 4. They'd spread out, trying to surround the cabin. Smart tactics, but they didn't know the terrain like he did. "There's a root cellar," he said, nodding toward a concealed trapdoor near the fireplace. "Connects to a tunnel I dug for emergencies. Comes out about 50 yards down the slope, behind that stand of lodgepole pines." Zara shook her head. "They got dogs. Tunnel just gonna lead them right to me, and you'll be trapped in here alone. Better than both of us dying." "Maybe dying ain't the worst thing could happen." Her hand went to her satchel, fingers tracing symbols embroidered on its worn leather surface. "My grandmother used to say that some fights choose you, whether you're ready or not. Said the spirits don't hand out power without expecting you to use it." Jeremiah studied her face in the firelight, seeing something he recognized from his own mirror during the worst nights of the war. That look of someone who'd been pushed past their breaking point and discovered they were stronger than they'd imagined. "You talking about magic again?" "I'm talking about choice." Zara moved away from the door, positioning herself where she could see both the front entrance and the windows. "You've been up here hiding from your power, same as I've been running from mine. Maybe it's time we stopped." The first rifle shot splintered the shutters, sending wood fragments across the cabin floor. Jeremiah dropped low, pulling Zara down with him as more shots followed. The hunters had positioned themselves well, crossfire from multiple angles, designed to pin them down while the real assault began. "Still think we should run?" Zara asked, her voice steady despite the chaos. Jeremiah chambered around, feeling something cold and familiar settle over him. Not fear, but focus. The same clarity that had kept him alive through 3 years of hell. "No," he said. "I think it's time I remembered who I used to be." The next rifle shot punched through the cabin's front wall, spraying splinters across Jeremiah's carefully arranged medical texts. A page from Gray's Anatomy fluttered to the floor, its detailed illustrations of the human circulatory system now decorated with wood shards and gun smoke. Something primal awakened in Jeremiah's chest. Not rage, but recognition. He'd felt this same cold focus during the siege at Vicksburg, when Confederate snipers had turned his field hospital into a shooting gallery. The muscle memory was still there, buried beneath months of sickness and self-pity. "Cover the back window," he told Zara, then called out toward the shattered shutters. "This is private property. State your business," a gravelly voice answered through the storm. "We want the Negro woman. Send her out and nobody else needs to get hurt." Jeremiah caught Zara's sharp intake of breath. She'd pressed herself against the wall beside the rear window, peering through a gap in the logs. Her face had gone ashen. "I know that voice," she whispered. "Silas Hartwell. He's the one been tracking me since Kansas." The name meant nothing to Jeremiah, but the fear in Zara's eyes told him everything he needed to know. Professional slave catchers were a different breed from common bounty hunters. They specialized in human quarry, knew how to break spirits as well as bodies. Another shot splintered the door frame, followed by Hartwell's voice again. "Mountain Man, you harboring stolen property. Best send her out before this gets unpleasant." Stolen property. The words hit Jeremiah like a physical blow, dredging up memories of auction blocks and broken families. He'd seen enough human bondage during his march through Georgia to last several lifetimes. The Emancipation Proclamation had been law for 5 years now, but men like Hartwell apparently hadn't received the message. "Property's already been freed by President Lincoln," Jeremiah shouted back, sighting down his rifle barrel toward muzzle flashes in the tree line. "War's over, in case you hadn't heard." Harsh laughter echoed through the wind. "War ain't over for everybody, medic. Some folks still remember what side you were on at Shiloh." The blood in Jeremiah's veins turned to ice water. Shiloh. They knew about Shiloh, which meant this wasn't random. Someone had told them exactly where to find him, exactly how to hurt him. The mysterious wasting disease, the professional hunters, it was all connected. "You recognize me?" he called out, genuinely curious despite the circumstances. Jeremiah Hawthorne, 15th Illinois Infantry, attached to Field Medical Corps. "You saved a lot of Union boys who should have died proper." The voice had moved closer, maybe 30 yards out now. "Cost us the battle when your boys came back healthy enough to fight." A new voice joined the conversation, younger, with a distinct southern drawl. "You also saved some Confederate prisoners, didn't you, Hawthorne? That against regulations?" The accusation struck home with devastating accuracy. Jeremiah had treated wounded Confederates, against direct orders from his commanding officer. Military protocol demanded Union wounded receive priority, but he'd never been able to watch men die from treatable injuries. Human suffering didn't wear uniforms. "Hippocratic oath doesn't recognize national boundaries," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Well, your oath's about to get you killed." The young voice was definitely closer now, along with your pet negress. That last word shattered something fundamental in Jeremiah's restraint. He'd heard it shouted by plantation overseers, spat by Confederate officers, whispered by Union soldiers who should have known better. Coming from these men, hunters who'd tracked a healing woman through a blizzard like she was an escaped animal, it carried a particular venom. Zara must have sensed his reaction, because her hand touched his shoulder with surprising gentleness. "Don't let them make you angry," she whispered. "Anger makes you stupid, and we need you smart." But Jeremiah was already moving. Combat instincts overwhelming civilian caution. He kicked open the cabin door and stepped into the swirling snow, rifle raised. The storm provided perfect cover. Visibility was maybe 15 feet in any direction, turning the surrounding forest into a maze of shadows and wind-bent branches. The first hunter appeared through the snow like a ghost made solid, tall, lean, with pale eyes that reflected the cabin's firelight. Silas Hartwell, presumably, carrying a rifle that looked military-issue but well-maintained, a professional's weapon. "There's the hero," Hartwell said conversationally, as if they were discussing weather instead of murder. 6 months ago, you couldn't have stood upright long enough to piss your own name in the snow. Amazing what the right kind of healing can accomplish. The confirmation hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. They'd been watching him die, waiting for him to weaken enough for easy capture. The curse, because that's what it had been, regardless of how his rational mind rebelled against the concept, had been designed to deliver him alive, but helpless. "What do you want?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Hartwell's smile was winter cold. "Same thing we've always wanted, medic. Justice for the men you kept alive to kill our boys, starting with watching you lose everything you think you've built up here." Behind him, shapes moved through the trees, more hunters closing the circle. Jeremiah counted at least 4 distinct silhouettes, maybe 5, professional spacing overlapping fields of fire. These men knew their business. "The woman's just a bonus," Hartwell continued, "though I hear her bloodline's worth considerable money to certain collectors, folks who appreciate rare talents." Something inside Jeremiah's chest crystallized into diamond-hard resolve. He'd spent 2 years hiding from his failures, drowning his guilt in whiskey and isolation, but some lines couldn't be crossed, some fights couldn't be avoided. "Then I guess you'll have to go through me," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his newly healed body. Hartwell's laugh cut through the wind like broken glass. Brave words from a man standing alone in the snow. "But we both know you won't pull that trigger, medic. Not in your nature." The words struck deeper than any bullet could have. Jeremiah's finger hesitated on the trigger, muscle memory warring with a lifetime of conditioning. "First, do no harm." The physician's oath that had guided him through 3 years of war, the principle that had made him treat Confederate wounded even when it meant court-martial. How many times had he held death in his hands and chosen mercy instead? "See there?" Hartwell took a step closer, reading Jeremiah's hesitation like a well-worn book. "You're still the same soft-hearted fool who bandaged enemy soldiers while your own boys bled out waiting. Some men ain't built for killing, no matter what uniform they wear." Behind the cabin's shattered door, Jeremiah could sense Zara watching, waiting for him to act. She'd trusted him with her secret, revealed the truth about his curse, healed him when 1,000 others had failed. Now he stood between her and men who would drag her back to a life worse than death, and his hands shook like they had during those first terrible nights after Bull Run. The rifle felt impossibly heavy in his grip. During the war, he'd carried weapons but rarely used them. His hands had been for healing, not killing. Even when Confederate sharpshooters targeted his medical tent, he ducked and prayed and stitched wounds while other men handled the shooting. "Doctors save lives," his mentor had told him. "Let soldiers take them." "What's it gonna be, Hawthorne?" the younger voice called from somewhere to his left. "You gonna stand there all night pointing that rifle, or you gonna use it?" Through the swirling snow, Jeremiah caught glimpses of the other hunters moving into position. Professional killers, men who'd made peace with violence in ways he never had. They'd close the circle soon, eliminate his angles of retreat, force him into a choice between shooting and dying. But what if he missed? What if his hands shook at the crucial moment, the way they had when he'd tried to practice medicine after the war? He could see it already. The muzzle flash in the darkness, his shot going wide, Zara's scream as they dragged her away. Another failure to add to the catalogue of horrors that haunted his sleep. "She ain't worth dying for," Hartwell said, his voice almost gentle now. "Just a runaway slave with delusions of power. Hell, we might even let her go if you ask nice. This was always about you, medic. You and the debt you owe." The lie was obvious, but it touched something raw in Jeremiah's chest. How many men had died because he'd kept their enemies alive to fight another day? How many Union widows could trace their loss directly to his compassion? The mathematics of warfare were brutal and unforgiving. Every Confederate soldier he'd healed was another threat to boys fighting under the same flag. "You thinking about all those blue coats, ain't you?" Hartwell had moved closer, maybe 20 feet now, wondering if maybe we got a point. Maybe some debts need paying. Wind howled through the cabin's broken shutters, carrying the scent of gun oil and unwashed bodies. The other hunters were in position now. Jeremiah could feel their presence like wolves circling a wounded elk. Professional killers who'd tracked their quarry through impossible weather, who'd cursed him with some unholy sickness and waited months for him to weaken. And what was he? A broken-down army medic who'd built a cabin in the wilderness so he could drink himself to death in privacy. A man whose hands shook every time he touched blood, whose nightmares were populated by the faces of men he'd failed to save. What right did he have to stand against professional killers? What hope did he have of protecting anyone? "I can see it in your eyes," Hartwell said softly. "That doubt eating at you like cancer. You know you ain't cut out for this kind of work. Know you're gonna get that woman killed along with yourself." The words hit home with devastating accuracy. Jeremiah's rifle barrel dipped slightly, the weight suddenly overwhelming. Behind him, the cabin represented 2 years of careful isolation, a life built specifically to avoid moments like this. He'd come to these mountains to escape the responsibility of other people's lives, to stop making choices that got good men killed. "Just put down the rifle," Hartwell continued, his voice hypnotically reasonable. "Walk away. Let us handle our business, and you can go back to your peaceful little life up here. Ain't no shame in knowing your limitations." Through the storm, Jeremiah heard something that stopped his heart, the sound of the cabin door creaking open behind him. Zara was moving, probably trying to reach the root cellar, the escape route he'd offered, but the hunters would hear her, would know she was running, would close the trap before she could reach safety, unless he gave her time, unless he finally chose to fight instead of heal. The sound of Zara's footsteps behind him shattered every hesitation in Jeremiah's mind. Not the careful retreat toward the root cellar he'd expected, but deliberate steps bringing her closer to the door. She was going to surrender herself rather than watch him die for her freedom. No. The word tore from his throat like a battle cry. Jeremiah's rifle snapped up, all doubt evaporating in the space between heartbeats. The hesitation that had paralyzed him, the physician's oath, the weight of past failures, the fear of becoming what he'd sworn never to be, burned away like morning mist. This wasn't about taking life. It was about preserving it. Zara's life. The life of a woman who'd saved him when salvation seemed impossible. His first shot took Hawthorne in the shoulder, spinning the man sideways into the snow. Not a killing blow. Some habits died hard, but enough to drop him and scatter his careful confidence. The other hunters erupted from concealment like startled quail, their coordinated assault dissolving into chaos. "Stay inside!" Jeremiah roared over his shoulder, already moving toward the tree line. Standing still meant death. The cabin's walls wouldn't stop determined riflemen. But the storm was his ally now, turning every shadow into potential cover, every gust of wind into concealment. A muzzle flash bloomed to his left. The bullet carved splinters from a pine trunk inches from his head, but Jeremiah was already rolling, using terrain he knew better than his own pulse. 2 years of hunting these slopes had taught him every deadfall, every depression, every sightline that mattered. His second shot came from behind a boulder the size of a freight wagon. Another careful wound, this time a hunter's gun arm, sending the man's rifle spinning into the darkness. The military surgeon in him noted the clean entry and exit wounds even as he chambered another round. Disable, don't destroy. It was still possible to fight without becoming a killer. But the hunters had different rules. Hartwell's voice cut through the wind, thick with pain and rage. "Kill him! Kill them both! And burn that cursed cabin!" The words released something primal in the remaining men. Rifle fire erupted from multiple directions, no longer the careful shots of professionals but the desperate volleys of cornered predators. Bullets whined off stone and shredded bark around Jeremiah's position. One slug caught his left shoulder, spinning him against the boulder. The pain was sharp, immediate, but manageable. A flesh wound that would heal clean if he lived long enough. Blood soaked through his shirt, warm against the bitter cold. Through the chaos, he heard Zara's voice rising above the wind. Not screaming, not calling for help, but something else entirely. Words in a language that predated English, syllables that seemed to harmonize with the storm itself. The air around the cabin began to shimmer like heat waves over summer stone. Her power. Whatever gift had healed him was awakening again, but this time it felt different. Not the gentle restoration he'd experienced, but something wilder, more dangerous. The very atmosphere seemed to thicken, charged with potential energy. A hunter broke from cover 30 yards away, rifle raised for a killing shot. Jeremiah's third bullet found its mark, not flesh this time but the man's weapon, shattering the stock and sending him stumbling backward. Still not killing, but his restraint was fraying with each heartbeat. Then he saw movement near the cabin's rear wall. 2 hunters had circled around during the firefight, approaching Zara's position while Jeremiah engaged their companions. Professional tactics, using him as a distraction while they claimed their real prize. The sight of those men stalking toward the woman who'd saved his life shattered the last of Jeremiah's medical conditioning. These weren't patients to be healed, or enemies deserving mercy. They were predators who would drag Zara back to bondage, or worse. The mathematics of the moment were brutally simple. Their death saw her slavery. His fourth shot was different, deliberate, final. The lead hunter dropped like a stone, Jeremiah's bullet finding his heart with surgical precision. The man's companion spun toward the muzzle flash, but Jeremiah was already moving, using the storm and his knowledge of the terrain to close the distance. His bayonet, a relic from Shiloh that he'd kept for skinning game, slid between the second man's ribs with the same careful efficiency he'd once used to set broken bones. When it was over, 4 men lay still in the snow. Hartwell had crawled away into the darkness, leaving a blood trail that the storm would soon erase. Jeremiah stood over the bodies, rifles smoking in his hands, feeling something fundamental shift inside his chest. He wasn't a healer anymore. That man had died the moment he'd chosen violence over mercy, killing over compassion. But maybe that was acceptable. Maybe some transformations were necessary. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Zara emerged into the storm, her face glowing with residual power, eyes reflecting firelight like polished obsidian. "You crossed over," she said simply. "No going back now." Jeremiah looked down at the blood on his hands, some his own, some belonging to men who would never threaten another soul. She was right. The mountain hermit who drunk himself toward death was gone forever, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. "Then I guess we'd better keep moving forward," he said, and meant every word. The bodies lay scattered in the snow like broken dolls, their blood already freezing into dark crystals beneath the storm's fury. Jeremiah stood among them, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air, rifle still warm in his hands. The silence felt profound after the chaos. No more gunshots, no more shouted threats, just wind and the steady patter of snow on dead flesh. "We need to move," Zara said, her voice cutting through his contemplation. "Hartwell's wounded but not dead. And men like that don't travel alone. There'll be others coming." Jeremiah nodded, though part of him remained transfixed by what he'd done. During 3 years of war, he'd carried weapons but rarely used them. Now 4 men lay dead by his hand, and the weight of it settled on his shoulders like a familiar coat. Strange how natural it felt, how right. The physician's oath that had guided him for so long seemed suddenly quaint, a luxury he could no longer afford. "How many others?" he asked, already moving toward the cabin to gather supplies. "Hard to say. Bounty hunters work in cells, usually 6 to 8 men per group. These 4 were just the advance team." Zara followed him inside, her eyes scanning the shadows with predatory awareness. "There'll be a base camp somewhere within a day's ride. When Hartwell doesn't report back." She didn't need to finish. Jeremiah understood the mathematics of pursuit well enough. Professional hunters would converge on their last known position, like antibodies attacking an infection. The cabin that had been his sanctuary for 2 years was now a trap waiting to spring. While Zara gathered her few possessions, Jeremiah loaded ammunition and medical supplies into his field pack. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but the wound was clean. He'd had worse shaving. More concerning was the limited time they had before pursuit arrived in force. "The storm will cover our tracks for maybe 6 hours," he said, checking his rifle's action. After that, we rely on something besides luck." Zara shouldered her own pack, considerably smaller than his but somehow seeming to contain everything she needed. "There's a place we can go, people who might help." Jeremiah paused in his preparations. What kind of people? Her smile was enigmatic, touched with secrets he couldn't fathom. The kind who understand what we're running from. Ex-slaves, deserters, Indian families driven from their land. Folks who've learned that survival sometimes requires alternative arrangements. The implication hung between them like smoke. An underground community, people who existed in the spaces between law and civilization. Jeremiah had heard rumors during the war, networks that helped runaway slaves reach freedom, former soldiers who'd refused to return to a society that no longer recognized them, ghost towns populated by the dispossessed and the desperate. "How far?" he asked. 2 days through the high passes if we push hard. 1 day if we're willing to risk the low road. She met his eyes, gauging his resolve. But the low road takes us through territory where Hartwell's people might be waiting. Outside, the wind was already shifting, the storm's fury beginning to abate. Soon the snow would stop falling, leaving clear tracks for anyone skilled enough to read them. Professional hunters would have trackers among their number, men who could follow a whisper of sign through country that would baffle lesser pursuers. Jeremiah made his decision with the same finality that had guided his rifle shots. Low road. If we're going to face them anyway, better to choose the ground ourselves. Zara nodded approvingly. Spoken like a soldier. Former soldier, he corrected automatically, then reconsidered. Maybe some transformations were more complete than others. The man who'd built this cabin had been running from his military past, seeking peace in isolation. But peace was a luxury that required others to fight for it, and he was tired of letting other people pay the price for his comfort. They left the cabin as the storm began to fade, stepping over bodies that were already disappearing beneath fresh snow. Jeremiah didn't look back. Whatever life he'd built in these mountains was finished, ended the moment he'd chosen to fight rather than flee. Now there was only forward motion, deeper into a world where the rules he'd once lived by carried no weight. "Tell me about these people we're going to meet," he said as they descended toward the tree line. "What will they expect from us?" Zara's breath misted in the cold air. "Proof that we're what we claim to be. That we can be trusted with their lives the way they'll be trusted with ours. And if we can't provide that proof?" A smile was sharp as winter wind. "Then we'll discover what kinds of tests desperate people devise for strangers who know too much about their secrets." Behind them, something howled in the distance. Whether wolf or human signal, neither could say. The sound raised the hair on Jeremiah's neck, a reminder that they moved through territory where predators of every variety hunted the unwary. He checked his rifle's load and kept walking. The howl came again, closer this time, and Jeremiah's hand instinctively tightened on his rifle. Beside him, Zara moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years listening for pursuit, her head cocked toward the sound. "Wolf," she said after a moment, though uncertainty colored her voice. "Maybe." They pressed deeper into the valley, following a game trail that wound between towering pines heavy with snow. The storm had left the world transformed, every familiar landmark buried beneath pristine white that caught what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. Beautiful and treacherous. Tracks would show clearly here, but so would the movement of anyone following them. "These people we're going to meet," Jeremiah said, keeping his voice low. "How do you know they'll help? Could be they'll see two strangers as a threat to whatever arrangement they've built." Zara was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, carefully chosen. "Because I've been there before. 3 years ago, when I first reached Colorado territory." Something in her tone made him study her profile in the dim light. "You never mentioned that." "Lots of things I haven't mentioned." She stepped over a fallen log, pausing to examine the snow beyond for signs of disturbance. "That settlement, they call it Haven's End. It's where I learned that my healing wasn't unique. Where I discovered there were others like me, people carrying pieces of the old knowledge." The revelation hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. All this time, he'd thought Zara was alone in her abilities, a singular miracle in a world that had forgotten magic. But if there were others, a whole community of people with similar gifts, how many others? He asked. "Depends what you mean by, like me." They were descending now, the trail switchbacking down toward the valley floor. Sarah Crowfeather can speak with the dead. Old Henrik sees the future in broken glass. Maria Santos can call down lightning when the moon's right. Zara glanced at him, but healing like mine, the kind that can undo curses and bring men back from death's threshold, that's rarer. The implications staggered him. A community of people with abilities that defied everything he'd been taught about the natural world. No wonder they'd chosen to disappear from civilized society. Such gifts would make them targets for every desperate soul, every conman, every person seeking to exploit power they couldn't understand. "And they'll trust us, just like that?" Zara's laugh was soft and bitter. "Trust isn't something folks at Haven's End give easily. Most of them learned the hard way what happens when the wrong people discover what they can do. Sarah was nearly burned as a witch in Kansas. Henrik spent 2 years in an asylum because his family thought his visions were madness. Maria..." She shook her head. "Maria's story isn't mine to tell." They walked in silence for a while, working their way through a stand of aspen that creaked and whispered in the wind. Jeremiah found himself thinking about the implications of what Zara had revealed. If there truly was a community of people with supernatural abilities, then perhaps his curse hadn't been as unique as it seemed. Perhaps the Confederate sympathizers who targeted him knew about such things, had access to dark knowledge that could twist the natural order. "The men who cursed me," he said eventually. "They knew what they were doing, didn't they? This wasn't some folk remedy or old wives' tale. They had real knowledge. A kind of knowledge that corrupts everything it touches." Zara's voice carried a weight of old pain. "There are those who learn the old ways to heal, to protect, to nurture life. And then there are those who twist that same knowledge into weapons. Your curse was crafted by someone who understood exactly how to pervert healing into harm." A branch snapped somewhere behind them, the sound sharp in the still air. Both froze, listening. Jeremiah counted heartbeats, 10, 20, 30, before another sound reached them, the distant murmur of voices, too far away to make out words but unmistakably human. "How far to this haven's end?" he whispered. 6 hours, maybe 7. Zara was already moving, abandoning the trail for the deeper woods. "But we'll need to lose them first, or we'll be leading death right to innocent people." They plunged into unmarked wilderness, using deadfalls and rocky ground to mask their passage. Behind them, the voices grew clearer, multiple men, spread out in a search pattern, calling to each other as they worked the trail. Professional hunters, just as Zara had predicted. There, she pointed ahead to where the mountainside fell away into a deep ravine. "We cross there, double back along the far ridge. Make them think we're heading toward Denver instead of the high country." Jeremiah looked at the gap she indicated. 20 feet of empty air over rocks that would pulverize anything that fell. "That's not a crossing. That's suicide." Zara's eyes glinted with something that might have been anticipation. "Only if you're planning to jump." She began pulling items from her pack, rope, pitons, tools he hadn't seen her carry. Sometimes the safest path is the one no reasonable person would attempt. Behind them, the voices were getting closer. The rope felt thin as spider silk in Jeremiah's hands as he watched Zara hammer the first piton into the granite face above the ravine. 20 feet of empty air yawned below them, and beyond that, jagged rocks that would turn human bones to powder. Behind them, the voices of their pursuers grew steadily louder, maybe 15 minutes away, maybe 10. "You've done this before," he said, noting the practiced way she tested each anchor point. Different ravine, same principle. Her breath misted in the cold air as she worked. Sometimes running away means running toward the thing that scares you most. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 days ago, his greatest fear had been dying alone in his cabin, wasting away from a curse he couldn't understand. Now death seemed almost simple compared to what lay ahead, not just the immediate threat of the rope and the fall, but everything beyond it. The community Zara described, people with abilities that defied nature itself. What place did a former army medic have among such individuals? A shout echoed through the trees, closer than before. Someone had found their trail. "Time's up," Zara said, securing the last anchor. She'd rigged what mountain climbers called a Tyrolean traverse, a rope bridge spanning the gap, with a second line for safety. It looked sturdy enough in theory, but theory had a way of failing when gravity took hold. She clipped her improvised harness to the rope and looked back at him. "The people at Haven's End will test us," she said quietly. "Not just our intentions, but our resolve. They'll want to know if we can be trusted when everything we believe is challenged. What kind of tests? The kind that show who you really are when the mask comes off." Without another word, she pushed off from the ledge, sliding across the rope into darkness. Jeremiah watched her silhouette disappear into the shadows on the far side, his heart hammering against his ribs. Heights had never bothered him before. He'd climbed plenty of cliffs hunting mountain goats, but this felt different. This wasn't about physical courage. It was about trust. Trust in Zara's skill, in equipment he didn't understand, in a future he couldn't predict. Behind him, branches crashed. Multiple voices now, coordinated and professional. They'd found the ravine. He clipped into the rope system, said a prayer to whatever gods watched over fools and former soldiers, and stepped into empty air. The sensation was immediate vertigo, Wind rushing past his face, the rope sagging under his weight, the world wheeling around him like a fever dream. For a terrifying moment, he thought he'd miscalculated. That momentum would carry him straight into the rock face. Then Zara's hands seized his shoulders, hauling him onto the far ledge just as voices erupted from the position they'd abandoned. There! They went across the ravine. Impossible. Nobody's that crazy. Look at the ropes, you fool. Cut them. Cut them now. The sound of steel on hemp carried clearly across the gap. Zara was already pulling up their lines, coiling them with practiced efficiency as curses and rifle shots echoed from the far side. A few bullets whined overhead, but shooting across 20 feet of darkness with handguns was more gesture than threat. They'll have to go around now, she said, shouldering the rope. Add 6 hours to their pursuit, maybe 8 if they don't know the country. But Jeremiah was barely listening. The crossing had shaken something loose inside him, some fundamental assumption about what was possible. If a person could slide across empty air on a rope, trusting their life to knots and metal spikes, then perhaps other impossible things became possible as well. Perhaps the world was far stranger and more dangerous than his medical training had prepared him for. These tests you mentioned, he said as they climbed away from the ravine. What happens if we fail? Zara was quiet for a long moment, picking her way through loose scree that could avalanche at the slightest disturbance. When she finally answered, her voice carried a weight that made his blood run cold. Depends on what kind of failure it is. Some tests, you get a second chance. Others... She paused at the edge of a cliff face, studying the rock for handholds. Others determine whether you leave Haven's End alive. The words hung between them like the rope they'd just crossed, necessary, functional, and absolutely unforgiving. Jeremiah found himself thinking about the 4 men he'd killed at the cabin, how natural it had felt to choose violence over mercy. That transformation had been easy, almost inevitable. But what if the next change required something harder? What if becoming the person Zara needed him to be meant abandoning not just his old profession, but his old understanding of right and wrong? Behind them, frustrated shouts echoed across the ravine. Their pursuers had discovered the detour, beginning the long journey around. But the delay was temporary. Professional hunters didn't abandon pursuit over a single obstacle. Then we'd better not fail, Jeremiah said, and began to climb. The climb should have been straightforward. Jeremiah had scaled steeper faces tracking elk through these mountains. But exhaustion was taking its toll, and the rope crossing had drained more from him than just physical strength. His hands, usually steady enough to stitch wounds by candlelight, trembled as he searched for the next handhold. Halfway up the cliff face, his grip failed. The fall was brief but brutal. 10 feet of empty air before the safety rope snapped taut, jerking him against the rock with enough force to drive the breath from his lungs. Pain exploded through his shoulder, the old bullet wound tearing open. Warm blood soaked through his shirt as he dangled like a broken marionette. Jeremiah! Zara's voice cut through the roaring in his ears. Above him, she was already rappelling down, but her movements seemed sluggish, uncertain. When she reached him, her face was pale with more than cold. The crossing, she gasped, clipping into his harness to take some of the weight. Used too much, need time to recover. He understood then. Whatever power let her perform impossible feats came at a cost. The rope bridge, the perfectly placed pitons. Even her uncanny ability to navigate in darkness, all of it drew from the same well that had healed his curse. And that well was running dry. They made it to a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for both of them to stand. Jeremiah's shoulder burned like molten metal, but worse was the growing certainty that they'd traded one trap for another. The cliff stretched both above and below them, too far to climb with his injury, too far to descend without proper equipment. How long? He asked, pressing his back against the cold stone. To recover, Zara's silence was answer enough. Hours, maybe longer. Time they didn't have. A rifle shot cracked across the valley, the bullet sparking off granite 5 feet from Jeremiah's head. On the far side of the ravine, muzzle flashes winked like malevolent stars. Their pursuers had brought a sharpshooter with a long gun, someone who could make the distance they'd thought would protect them. "They can't see us clearly," Zara whispered, pressing herself against the rock face. "But they don't need to. Just keep us pinned until the rest circle around." Another shot, closer this time. Rock chips stung Jeremiah's cheek, and he tasted blood. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. They were trapped on an exposed ledge with a wounded man and an exhausted healer, facing professional hunters with military-grade equipment. Even if Zara's power returned, what could it do against rifles and patience? "There's something I didn't tell you," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "About Haven's End, about why they'll never trust us now." Jeremiah turned to look at her, noting the guilt written in every line of her face. "What?" "The tests I mentioned, they're not just about character. They're about whether you've been followed, whether you've compromised their location." Another bullet whined overhead, and she flinched. Bringing armed pursuit to their doorstep is an automatic death sentence. No exceptions, no appeals. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. They hadn't just failed to reach sanctuary. They'd destroyed any possibility of finding it. Even if they somehow escaped this ledge, even if they evaded capture and made it to the hidden community, they would be turned away or worse. The very act of being pursued had marked them as unacceptable risks. "So we're on our own," he said, and was surprised by how calm his voice sounded. "No help coming, no safe haven waiting. I'm sorry." Tears froze on her cheeks as they fell. "I thought we could lose them. I thought my power would be enough to—" A third shot cut off her words. This one close enough that he felt the bullet's passage like a hot breath against his neck. The shooter was finding his range, adjusting for wind and distance. The next shot might not miss. Below them, the sound of horses carried on the night air. The main pursuit force finally arrived and spreading out to cover escape routes. Above them, the cliff face stretched endlessly upward, impossible to climb with his torn shoulder and her depleted strength. Jeremiah closed his eyes, feeling the weight of absolute failure settle on his chest like stones. He'd survived a supernatural curse, discovered miraculous healing, found something that might have been love, and killed men to protect it all. For a brief moment, he'd thought himself transformed into someone worthy of the gifts he'd been given. Instead, he'd led death to innocent people and destroyed the only sanctuary that might have sheltered them both. The physician's oath he'd abandoned now seemed like wisdom, at least when he'd only tried to heal. He'd only failed individual patients. This new path had failures that rippled outward, touching lives he'd never meet. When he opened his eyes, Zara was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "There is one option," she said quietly, "but you won't like it."